So it is now 5 p.m. in Stockholm, and I wish you all a warm welcome to this highly topical webinar, to say the least. My name is Freddy Jönsson Hanberg. I am the head of strategic advice at MW Group, and I would like to thank you in the audience for taking your time to participate here today. It is our ambition that you will leave this webinar in an hour with new knowledge, insights, and ideas how to handle the current situation in your own organizations. It is a complex situation, and most of all, a terribly unpredictable situation. There are some lessons to be learned from history, from the diplomatic side, from the military side, and from exercises and simulations. I would strongly recommend you and your colleagues to conduct a scenario exercise as soon as possible based on what you hear on this webinar today. We are happy to assist with that, of course. Just send an email afterwards and we can discuss the format together. A scenario exercise during maybe half a day is the most efficient way to quickly find out weaknesses, vulnerabilities, threats, and risks so that you can mitigate and manage them as soon as possible. There is a lot of value and large assets at stake now. Now is the time to act. We have more than 200 participants that has registered for this webinar today, and that means it's impossible to conduct a regular Q&A, but we have gotten some questions sent to us in advance, and I will come back to them in about 40 minutes. I have also given them to the keynote speakers in advance, so they will probably address them. But it's also important that you know that if you have further questions that you feel you haven't got the answer to, then just please send all your questions in an email to us after the webinar, and I promise you that we will get back to you with the answers. The webinar is being recorded and will be found on MW Group's YouTube channel within a few hours after the webinar, so you can look at it again and show it to your colleagues. So having said that, I will now introduce our keynote speakers. First, we'll listen to Mr. Stefan Wallin, speaking from Helsinki. He will start off in a moment. He's the former Defense Minister of Finland, followed by Lieutenant General Joseph Anderson, former Deputy Chief of Staff for the US Army, speaking from Washington. And then here in Stockholm, Johan Victorin, founder of and CEO of Intel Group. And finally, Hans-Tino Hansen, founder and CEO at Risk Intelligence, and he will speak from Copenhagen. So with that, without further ado, I would like to hand over the microphone to Stefan Wallin. Please, Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Freddie. And good evening to everybody. Greetings from Helsinki. Thank you for the possibility to address you this very special day, as things happening not very far from the Nordic countries. You know, we Finns are often being asked by foreign friends about how horrible it is, or it must be, to have a 1,300-kilometer common border with our eastern neighbor, Russia. Of course, you could say it's horrible with this border, but we Finns used to think that it would be even more horrible if we did not have this border with Russia. Now there's been a lot of focus on the border, or what's left of it, between Russia and Ukraine. I would like to start with a short recapitulation of what's behind the Russian behavior, the Russian mindset, or if you want, Putin's mindset. What we see right now is the culmination of a logical development as a result of Vladimir Putin's way of thinking. Putin's mindset is about geopolitics, it's about nationalism, power. His driver is to restore Russia's role, impact, and reputation in the world. The Russia he inherited in year 2000 after Boris Yeltsin was a weak shadow of its past. During Yeltsin's time in power, the corridors in Kremlin had smelled of a combination of vodka and expensive cologne water from the oligarchs. The Russian economy was in a poor condition, and the weak Russian political interest for life outside its own borders made it possible for former East Bloc countries, as well as the Baltic countries, to join EU as well as NATO. Putin's general idea has been to to restore Russia's lost position as a superpower in all fields: politics, military, culture, sports, and so forth. He wants the world to take Russia seriously, listen to Russia's voice, respect Russia's interests, history, capabilities, with a taste of fear. Therefore, Russia is said to be unpredictable. That's not totally true. Almost everything that Russia does or does not do can, from public sources, be tracked to the near past. In this context, and I repeat, in this context, it seems more rational than irrational what Russia does. Putin's speech in Munich, the Munich Security Conference in 2007, that is 15 years ago, was a very clear message: anti-USA, anti-NATO, pro-Russia, pro-Russian history. Putin concluded, and this is a quote, "Russia is a country with a history that spans more than 1,000 years and has practically always used the privilege to carry out an independent foreign policy. We are not going to change this tradition today." End of quote, Vladimir Putin, 2007. Then happened the war against Georgia the next year in 2008, the hijacking of Crimea, 2014, aggressions in eastern Ukraine, and now the huge military operation and what Putin calls peacekeeping on the pro-Russian and separatist-controlled areas. So we are on the brink of war because of Russian nationalism and retro-romantic idealism, blind power politics, and the belief that spheres of influence are still possible. It has not primarily to do with Russia, what we see right now. Russia, with its EU and NATO ambitions, is a poor tool, a jolly good excuse. The big picture is Russia's pride and still lost pride. As Putin said on Monday in his speech, that he admires Stalin's time in power, a time of unity. Well, not to forget Putin's own ego. The ongoing operation is, as we know, being carried out by a leader who has made himself irreplaceable by faking election results and changing the constitution that no longer limits the number of consecutive presidential terms. Now he could rule up to 2036 if he stays alive. This is at least one part of the background explaining why we are here today. We must believe, of course, that some kind of diplomacy, common sense, can still make a difference. But we can't be sure about that, at least not after the past 2 days. Everything between a full-scale war to Russian withdrawal is possible, and everything in between. The Finnish President Sauli Niinistö has a personal hotline to the Kremlin as well as the White House and has tried to mediate. But Putin has a strange way of saying thanks for the efforts. On Monday, Putin said that Lenin made a mistake in 1917 when allowing independence to neighbors. One of them, not mentioned by name by Putin, but still was Finland. From a Nordic perspective, we have all reasons to be worried. A war in Central Europe with 2 superpowers involved can only affect security and stability in the whole continent in a negative way. War and sanctions is a bad combination. The diplomatic path should be a possibility, maybe a winning brand for the Nordic countries who have produced so many UN Secretary Generals and Nobel Peace Prize winners over the years. But now it's not about facing rational argumentation, rational behavior. More muscles than just the Nordic ones are now needed. If EU, the OSCE, and the US diplomacy can't manage now, there is unfortunately very little hope for diplomacy left. The UN Security Council is once again, as we know, a teethless paper tiger thanks to the veto. If the conflict escalates, the immediate consequences, as we have already seen, will affect stock markets globally, as well as oil prices and energy prices. The heaviest form of EU and US sanctions to be used as the next step could be devastating for Russia, but would also make companies and business in EU countries and the Nordics suffer. It goes without saying that the more business you do with Russia, direct or indirectly, the more risks you are facing right now. We have experiences. The sanctions after Crimea caused immediate severe damage for many companies, but the permanent losses are limited, of course, with some exceptions as always. New markets and possibilities have appeared, and also other reasons, such as the weak ruble and unstable operation environments in Russia, have been maybe even more fatal than the sanctions. After the invasion of Crimea in 2014, the Finnish milk and cheese giant Valeo lost 400 million euros just overnight in selling. They had to dump surplus stocks of cheese to the Finnish market for €1 each. They got the nickname Putin cheese. But later, Valeo found new markets in the US, but also established production in Russia to be on the safe side. Now we don't know about that. Finnish exports to Russia today is about 3 billion euros a year. That is 5.5% of total Finnish exports. Swedish exports to Russia was last year, in 2020, about 1.9 billion euros, and always less than that, about 1 billion euros. About 10% of all Norwegian salmon export was sold to Russia. In Finland, we have a big and sad case, and I will finally share that one with you now. It's the Fennovoima. That's a nuclear power plant planned to be built in the northern parts of Finland in Pyhäjoki. The project is already underway. 38%, almost 40% of the company in charge of the project is owned by Rosatom, the Russian state-controlled company, 38%. Rosatom will also deliver the nuclear reactor technology and supplies. It was not meant to be this way. The biggest owner of Fennovoima was originally, in 2009 and 10, the German energy giant E.ON. The reactor was supposed to come from the west, possibly Toshiba. But it all changed in 2012 when E.ON got cold feet and withdrew from this 7 billion euro project and eventually sold its shares to Rosatom. Now, as you can understand, things have come into a new light. The Finnish Ministry of Defense has serious concerns about the project and has asked for official investigations on the project's security and political implications. The project has already been delayed because of Rosatom's inability to deliver needed reports. The plant should have been up and running in 2024. Now it's going to be earliest 2029, if at all. A huge part of the rest of the shares in the company are owned by small Finnish local energy companies and other enterprises in need of energy around in Finland. Many are now trying to sell their shares, but you can understand the market is very limited right now. Many subcontractors are worried about what will happen. The government in Finland will soon have to decide about the final permission to start the building of the Rosatom reactor. As you can understand, that's going to be a very tricky one. I think I will end here and we'll have a good discussion later about these topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as I said before, we have had some questions sent in advance to us, but we will come back to them later. And first, we would like to listen to Joe Anderson. Please, Joe, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Freddie, and hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us, and thanks for letting me join you all from Washington. My focus of this evening's discussion is on large-scale combat operations and what the implications are from a force generation perspective in Europe. And I think first and foremost, what's important to realize is everything we've learned to this point, how we learned, is much, much different from a counterinsurgency, stability, and support operations perspective in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Syria. So the force buildup, I'm sure you all understand at this point, is totally in support of NATO partners on bordering countries, and how we learned, what the impacts are going to be. I'll walk you through those quickly, and then I'll give you about 8 points of what we've learned in terms of friction points and what it's going to mean for all of Europe. And I think you're very familiar with how this all began, Cold War days, and what we learned via reforgers, which was massive deployments to demonstrate force presence. And this was all from a force generation, power projection perspective, how that evolved to Partnership for Peace in the 90s when the wall came down and how through partnerships very much similar to what's happening as you're watching today, how that built capabilities in and around the region. That migrated towards Operation Atlantic Resolve, which was a rotational brigade focus with many enablers, but once again to demonstrate capabilities. And then that quickly evolved into the Enhanced Forward Presence mission, which was the NATO deterrence mission throughout the Baltics between Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and of course Poland, spread across the lead nations of the UK, Canada, the Germans, and the US. And those were all based on battle groups. And then that quickly evolved into Defender Europe, which became a modern day first target was in 20. And of course, COVID had huge implications there, but that was to counter the Zapad exercises, but to once again go back to a reforger type presence for deterrence. And this is all on top of what's already from a forward presence perspective permanently based in Europe. And again, that footprint tried to expand in Poland, but based on the 2nd Cavalry Regiment in Germany and the 173rd Airborne in Vicenza, Italy. And on top of all that becomes the pre-positioned stocks, and that's what's going to complicate the friction points here in a second. But again, what's afloat versus what's on land and versus what's afloat when it comes on land, how that supports follow-on contingency forces on top of the types of forces that I just described. So that's how we learned everything here since early 80s. And now I'll give you some of the specific points that are going to affect what the topic of today is and how this affects private sector. Number one becomes, should be fairly obvious, it becomes an air and seaport of embarkation challenge. Those become significant choke points as supplies, material, and basically it's a combination of personnel, it's a combination of rolling stock, which means vehicles, it's a combination of all kinds of equipment and supplies, and those of course are all measured in short tons. But that becomes a huge friction point around Europe as this stuff flows into theater. Next becomes the challenge on lift, different word, transport, combination of sea and air of how it all gets there. That is a combination of government assets as well as commercial contract assets, and that does put a strain on the system, and that could have impacts on freedom of movement and freedom of navigation as a side effect as well. Next becomes the actual lines of communication, and in simpler terms, roads and rail, and those become, again, congestion, backlog, throughput challenges, and of course, when you're talking on the rail, which has been a challenge for a long time, is the challenges of gauge, differences of gauge, and transportability, let alone the environment, weather, bridges, other choke points that create challenges. Another one, which you would think would be a more simpler one that fix over time, but has not, has been the border clearance issue and how you get access and freedom of movement to make sure, again, you are not being backed up at border crossings, which again affects many entities, none the least is commercial. One of the questions that was thrown at us was the supply chain stuff, and of course this becomes the fifth friction point, and that is competition for challenges for classes of supply. The easier ones to figure out why are more difficult. Stefan just mentioned fuel, energy, but bulk fuel, bulk water as a minimum. Then you've got a variety of other things, again, from everything from food to barrier material to end items, vehicle swap outs, ammunition swap outs, and don't forget that becomes a two-way as you sustain operations. That becomes a backhaul challenge as well as a forward throughput challenge as you're bringing stuff back out for battle damage repair, shelf life issues for things like ammunition. Next becomes number 6 is maintenance. And that becomes a big challenge in terms of parts. And of course, you're already watching an exacerbated stretch system for microchips and those types of technologies and what that means in terms of a demand and a supply. And of course, again, in this particular case, sustained operations when those things go bad. The next one, which is a very large one, is the basing and staging, and this becomes a huge drain on infrastructure. And again, that's a geography challenge as well as, again, in facilities, energy, goods and services, how much of that can be contracted, and again, how much does that put a drain on what other folks are trying to do commercially in other places. But these bases, as you all know, become pretty much mini cities, very similar to mini cities and what their requirements are, and that's a big drain on, again, space, resources, assets, etc. And the last one I'll just throw out there now, and that'll be enough, I think, to get us on track here. It is NATO standardization, and one of the problems we've had with that is trying to reinvigorate that. Post-Cold War days, that hasn't gone so great, as demonstrated in things like enhanced forward presence, but the more diversity of line items and quantity, when you have less standardized kit, that puts more strain on the supply chain and challenges, again, from everything from a quantity to parts to transportation assets. So I think that should be a pretty good start for food for thought. And Freddie, I'll pass it back over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a pretty good start. So now Stefan has painted the picture of the sort of diplomatic landscape and what is to be expected from the Russian side. Joe made an excellent overview over what it means if there will be large-scale combat operations in the vicinity of Europe. And Johan, I know that you have a number of known unknowns and maybe some unknown unknowns, but please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Freddie, and good evening, everyone. Pleasure to speaking to you about this subject with sanctions, and we have seen a lot of lawfare taking place the last decade, ranging all the way from the GDPR from the EU, of course, to protect citizens, but also to raise barriers from competition, to the Chinese intelligence law, coercing people to cooperate with Chinese intelligence. And now the Chinese also have introduced a kind of supra GDPR that makes it very difficult to transfer data from China to the rest of the world. So we have seen now the first package of sanctions going in. Individual sanctions, not much really effect, I believe, because they have been preparing to absorb these kind of things. And US, for example, sanctioned the individuals that the British sanctions yesterday, so they are already on sanctions list, and not much effect from that. But doing business then with Russia, as Stefan mentioned before, will of course affect companies directly from the beginning. The Russians are, as I said, very well prepared. They have a gold reserve for $630 billion. They have a low debt. So this first package is not that very much from a Russian point of view. So they could then match the second stage if they were to go into Donbass and to seize that territory. Then you can see a higher lift up of sanctions directing against the biggest banks in Russia. The Western world have been hesitant so far to do that because that affects Russian citizens. But coming into that sphere, you have to see which banks are good enough to sanction that, because you have problems here going for sanctions against Sberbank, which is the largest bank in Eastern Europe, would be a counterblow to yourself and your own countries. So that will be doing with a lot of appreciations before doing these sanctions. The next level is export controls, and that it could be then to control the export of, for example, semiconductors has been mentioned, and that could be a real blow for the Russian industry, because the alternatives that are Chinese, and they are behind US and especially behind South Korea and Taiwan at the moment. So that would be a less effect for Russia, and we could see that they have tried to make sure that they have their own industry in order to produce chips, but that is a long way to do that. But what's interesting is Russian counter-sanctions. We have agreed to not go into energy sanctions from the Russian side because that is an entirely own seminar. But just to mention a few areas where the Russian could strike back is in metals with palladium affecting the automotive industry. It's also nickel. It's the world top producer and exporter of nickel, and that could affect then the when you produce copper and iron, or sorry, steel. So that is also something to bear in mind, that they could perform as a counteract against us. Also very important, agricultural sector. They already stated that they restricted their wheat exports and also their nitrogenous fertilizers on the 5th of February. And they are very large exporters of ammonium nitrate. And that will be exacerbated then if they do take the whole of Donbass, because that's a very important agricultural area, not only in Europe, but in fact in the whole world. It's home of the 25%, alongside with the Crimea, of the black soil volume in the world. So it's two-season agricultural possibilities there. Ukraine, a large exporter of corn and wheat, and this will eventually drive up food prices in the MENA and in South America, Brazil, and countries like that. And that could be then cascade effects from that affecting the general world trade in a larger sense, with a lot of social unrest, etc., as we saw in 2011. The Ukrainians also have important minerals, metals, titanium, that is in the Donbass area as well, and also the area immediately southwest and west of Donbass. There are some rare earth elements there, as scandium and gold also. Uranium is protected in the center of Ukraine so far, you can say. Lastly, I would like to speak a little bit about what I coined grey sanctions, and that is to use, for example, cyber attacks from criminal proxies, preferably through software suppliers, as we have seen in the past, because then you can affect a lot of companies or organizations simultaneously. This will, of course, drive up costs for the private sector when it comes to control individuals, to get a better cybersecurity, and it will also slow down transactions, because nation states are now introducing different legislations in order to get control who is acquiring what in our country. To kind of bridge over to Hans, I'd like to point out that UK and US today sent out a warning from a malware framework from the GRU, the Russian Military Intelligence Service. And this malware family called Cyclops Blink, and that is a malware that affects different drivers, firmwares installed in networks, etc. And that is very interesting, because in 2017 there was a big attack called the NotPetya, as you recall, one of the biggest in history, which affected text preparation software in Ukraine and then cascaded out throughout the world, and that affected logistic flow all over the world, targeting Maersk and FedEx, for example. And I think that's a good handover to you, Hans.
Excellent. Thank you, Johan. I will come back to you with some questions later, but first, Hans Tino, what do you say about this? Is it time for Maersk to update the virus program? I think you have some slides you want to show, yeah?
Yes, correct. I do have some slides, and cyber is one of the things that is in the presentations, as Johan already alluded to. What I will do is that I will talk about the threats to the logistics and the supply chain from 4 concentric circles. So one focusing on Ukraine, one on the Black Sea, and one on Europe, and one globally. They will be in a decreasing level of detail, but here we go. If we start with Ukraine, then Ukrainian economy has already been impacted by the Russian threats. One of the things that happened already from December was that international investments completely stopped. That is, of course, having a big effect on development of businesses and leisure and industries in Ukraine. And of course, now it won't be better, at least for the time being. Imports have been increasingly difficult by sea, mainly because of Russian nav warnings, because of so-called exercises that have been decreasing freedom of navigation for ships. If we look at the actual and potential impact on Ukraine, on the left-hand side you have ports, maritime operations, airports, railroads, communication and trucking. Then you can say that right now we are still, except for the contact line between the two so-called republics, Russian recognized republics, and the rest of Ukraine, where they have kinetic contact, then the rest of the kind of operations ongoing are cyber and potentially hybrid operations. And if we look at ports, they are being hit by cyber attacks. If we go to military level, so if the Russians go kinetic, then they could be attacked by airstrikes. They could also have sea mines deployed, and you can have amphibious operations and similar. Sanctions, as Johan mentions, will also impact on the Ukrainian ports, mainly due to sanctions against Russia, because there is trade between Russia and Ukraine. There is also transit trade between Russia and Ukraine, and there are container lines that go to Russia and then to Ukraine. If you look at the maritime operations, then on the sanctions side, they could also have an impact from crew changes, because there are crews on many ships in the world that are partly Russian, partly Ukrainian, sometimes mixed. If there is a ban on payments in US dollars, ultimately that will also have impact on shipping and maritime operations. I won't go through all of them. It's just to say that there can be impact on different levels with different modes of transportation and communication. One of them being with trucking, that for instance you can have huge queues lining up at the border of Ukraine because of cyber attacks against, for instance, customs clearance systems that could have a big impact. On the sanctions side, there could be less transnational traffic, just like on the maritime side. There is transnational traffic through Ukraine from Russia and from Asia, actually. If we then go one step further in the circle and look at Ukraine, Russia, and the Black Sea, then all Ukrainian ports are obviously in the Black Sea and therefore impacted by anything that the Russian Navy and military chooses to do. On the Russian side, there is substantial trade through Novorossiysk at the Black Sea, and also through the inland waterways, for instance, the Don River that connects all the way to the Caspian Sea. Trade in the Sea of Azov. The Sea of Azov is the area, the sea zone right here on the border of the Ukraine concentric circle. That is very limited after the Kerch Bridge construction, and mostly Russian. As mentioned, a large percentage of Russian and Ukrainian seafarers, they are actually originating from this area, from the Black Sea area. Impact from sanctions are difficult to judge, but will be severe for Russia in the end if they continue the path they are on right now. If we then look at the area, and I won't go through all of it, it's just to say Ukraine, we already looked at that. We could actually, if we go to Russia, we could have in a kinetic situation, so an enhanced or kind of continued invasion of whatever sort and scenario it'll be. We could look into possible Ukrainian retaliation with special forces or with mines on Russian ports. Otherwise, Ukraine also have a cyber capabilities, so they could attack back with cyber attacks against ports, airports, railroads, and so on. One thing that is important that you probably also saw in some of the clips on television or on Twitter is the movement of military on roads and railroads, which of course takes up a lot of capacity, something that Joe already alluded to, and something that I'll return to in just a short moment. If we look at other countries in the Black Sea region, there can be some impact, or basically indirect, from sanctions against Russia, which would mean less trade in the region, which could impact port operations and maritime operations also for the neighboring countries. If we look at communication, for instance, there may be cyber attacks from Russia against those countries that are NATO countries or NATO partner countries in the area. If we then move to Europe, then the railroads are at a very high level of capacity, about 99%, which transports 15% of the modal industrial volume in Europe. Roads are congested already, especially in Germany. Ports are being impacted by the global supply chain challenges that we all know of, if we want a Sony PlayStation or something similar. Impact from sanctions are difficult to judge, but may be severe in some areas. If we look at Europe, then in the current situation, trade is largely unaffected, except for the uncertainty and decisions that are fueled by uncertainty. Energy, gas imports already down. Raw materials is largely status quo, except for the supply chain issues that we already addressed that has nothing to do with the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Logistics, largely unaffected, except obviously for air traffic to Ukraine. And maritime has some restriction in northern Black Sea, as already discussed. Some ship owners are already avoiding the Black Sea. You see down on finance, you have interest rates and stock markets that are impacted, especially because of uncertainty. If we have a scenario with an escalation, we will see a different decrease in trade volumes and probably, especially on energy, as we discussed earlier, decreased supply from Russia on raw materials, and I'll get back to that in a moment. And then we may have movements of NATO troop movements, as Joe mentioned, that will actually take up a lot of capacity on rail and ports. And I have an example in a moment. We can also may we may see cyber attacks against communication and finance and logistics from the Russian side. Full-scale invasion of Ukraine, not necessarily the full of Ukraine, but actually a full-scale military operation. We will have a lot of effects that may fully stop Ukrainian and Russian exports, including Russian energy exports, and so on and so forth. Just to mention as an example, then I will take two examples from Denmark, where in 2018 at the bottom, the Royal Irish Battle Group, which was about 1,500, so 1/2 to 1/3 of a brigade, moved through Denmark on the way to Norway. 550 vehicles in 6 sections of 90 vehicles, in subsections each of 10. That meant that each subsection was about 500 meters long, meant that each section was 4.5 kilometers, and the whole group, if it was stacked together, which it wasn't, is 27 kilometers. It's just to try to give you an idea about how much these movements actually will take up of road and ports and rail as well. If we then go to the global side, then as discussed, global supply chains are already being challenged. Energy supplies may be redirected from Qatar and US due to more flexible market dynamics. Also, there are some storage of gas, and there are many others. There's a very good article in The Economist, by the way, on what can replace Russian stop of gas exports. Raw materials are, on the other hand, more difficult to source quickly. Impact from sanctions depend on which area it is, and what will be sanctioned on the Russian side, and what the Russians decide to stop as a countermeasure against sanctions. Russian assets in Europe and USA potentially to be seized. If we look at the impact on the Russian economy, then this is the Russian exports from February 2020 to March 2021. And you see that all the red arrows are the ones that are, you could say, part of the West one way or another. You may actually argue to include South Korea, but in this, it's about up to $135 billion in exports per year, and about 40% of the total Russian exports that is at risk at that moment. On the other hand, if we're looking at what we are importing from Russia, then Russia is the second largest gas exporter in the world, with 17% of world output, third largest oil exporter with 12% world output, and then maybe to some surprise to some that it is actually the largest grain exporter in the world. And as Johan alluded to, then if they also get control of the whole region of Donbass, they will actually sit on a lot of grain production worldwide. As also mentioned by Johan, largest mineral fertilizer exporter in the world. And then we come down to the minerals and metals, third largest aluminium exporter, third largest gold exporter. I think we can live without gold, at least for some time. But then at the bottom, you have second largest platinum exporter in the world and largest palladium exporter in the world with more than 20% of world output. If we then look a little bit further away to Asia, and now this is China I'm focusing on, then ship-based logistics will largely be unaffected because they go, you could say, outside the area of conflict. Air cargo will be largely unaffected except for rerouting over, obviously, Ukraine, parts of Russia and Belarus. Train-based logistics, however, may come to a complete stop. That is not a big area, but it is being used. Actually, air cargo is much bigger than train-based logistics that you see. That's all that what I had for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans-Tino. Excellent. And I think actually you have already answered the questions that we got sent in advance about how the flow of goods from Asia would be affected and also increased inflation. Maybe something you can say something about the freight rates and container prices. How will they be affected? Even, I mean, they are already affected after the pandemic, but what do you say?
If we're talking about freight from Asia, then it won't be impacted directly from all of this. You could actually say that if there will be a recession because of the crisis, then it will decrease trade and thereby rates will go down. However, I don't see that because we still have a deficit on the supply side, which means that the problem that we have already won't go away. It may be reduced somewhat by this. It depends on how big the crisis will become, and it's difficult to actually to tell. But I don't see it will increase because of this crisis so far.
Okay, thank you. Just one more comment. I don't think you addressed the challenges regarding the winter wheat. Did you say anything about that? Because I mean, you have the largest producers of winter wheat are. Besides Russia and Ukraine, also Kazakhstan and Romania, and that makes it sort of twofold that both these countries are affected by the crisis and the conflict, and that it's also the main bulk of that good is transported out of the Black Sea. So I mean, it's a twofold risk there. Have you thought anything about that?
Yes, I didn't want to go into it because Johan already mentioned, and as Johan mentioned, the main trading partners for grain is not Europe. It's South America, it's Africa, to some extent Asia. But you're right, it is seaborne. Obviously, you cannot transport grain in other sensible ways, at least to these places. And so that will have an impact on the grain export and will have an impact on grain world market price. And I think that for many of the other commodities I mentioned, there will be an impact on the world market price.
Thank you. So then I will go over to Johan. I go sort of backwards back and end up with Stefan. Just a reminder to the audience that we got some questions sent in advance to us, and you can also send in your questions afterwards, and we will try to answer them as best as we can. Johan, I think you have already addressed in one way or another the questions that got sent in advance, but there's one question that I don't think that you addressed, and that is how if we look at Russian-owned companies in Europe, and there are some famous examples. Stefan mentioned a few of them. We have some in Sweden as well. But are they sort of will they be affected in some way regarding the discussion you had around sanctions, and how will they act, so to speak, if they are a quite important player in a nation? What will be their modus operandi, so to speak? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
No, it takes us into the energy sector then, which is in time. But for example, then to reduce the flow of energy in whatever form will affect Western Europe is not that very well situated at the moment when it comes to gas supplies. We have to switch then to LNG, for example. That is only the UK, the France, and the Spain's that has capacity in larger volumes to take that, but Spain doesn't have the pipelines to distribute that through the rest of Europe, for example. We also know that gas is used for important industries to make turbines going, so that could affect, for example, an aluminium industry, for example. If it comes to Russian private-owned companies, I'm only aware of Yandex, which is situated in the Netherlands, and there might be some clients to them that has cloud service from Yandex, but apart from that, I don't see that really. Then I think it's more on the individual basis that you're situated in a position where you are a good venue for Russian intelligence, and they might coerce or bribe you to do things for Russia.
Yeah,
and that drives friction.
It sure does. Great, thank you for a good answer, clarifying. I would then go to Joseph Anderson. Are you with us? Joe.
Joe is here.
Yeah, great. I have some follow-up questions for you. I think you actually very well addressed all the questions that we got in advance, but could you elaborate a little bit? Because I mean, you mentioned the sort of logistic footprint and what it means to transport that large amounts of troops through Europe, and that has been exercised, etc. But then you touched upon, but I would like you to elaborate a little bit on the procurement aspect, because we have in Luxembourg, we have the NATO Support and Procurement Agency, and their sort of main business idea is to sign up contracts with a lot of private contractors that should be sort of ready when something happens. And so that is how the contracts are designed. But that means also that you will have a situation now where they might, in collaboration then with the United States, of course, start to procure these things. And I mean, in that situation, if you are on the other side of that contract, you know that this will be costly for you, and that would probably drive up prices, and that would probably affect the rest of the market as well. We have been touching upon the different petroleum products, etc., but that everyone uses. Also the same for food, of course, that everyone needs, and transport, not least. But how is the sort of way to deal with that from the United States side? How do you sort of not drive up prices in an uncontrolled way? Is that something that you have been looking into, or been discussing, or any experience from?
Well, there are clearly efforts ready to make sure that you don't blow the prices off the roof, but the reality is, in this scenario, based on, so cost doesn't necessarily become the driving factor, which is probably not what you want to hear. The real issue becomes time, and when time is limited, and that's kind of where we are today, I think you'd all agree. And then the question becomes, based on the limited, what's actually being deployed, and what's actually being deployed is not large numbers of sustainment function type personnel. And so obviously from a contract perspective, you're going to be looking for back to that base operations, back to the maintenance, back to the supply chain, whatever can be outsourced. There are protocols in place, again, to try to keep it under some semblance of control. However, the reality of again, time will be the driving forcing function, not so much cost.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you, and I think that the time is the most important factor here, and I think that that would also be clearly communicated from the different parties, and I think it would be done in collaboration with the European Union as well. So I think I'm not so worried about it, but I think that someone in the audience might want to know how this is being managed, so to speak.
Yeah, no, and I think and back to that base infrastructure, based on the ones that we can fall on top of that we have used from an exercise perspective, those remain not very robust and not very capable and not very state of the art, and so that only complicates the problem. Yes, they can be lily pads or footprints or whatever term you want to give them to launch things from, or at least occupy. But from a capabilities perspective, they don't provide the best of capabilities.
True. Thank you very much. And then I will continue with Stefan, and I think we have two quite interesting questions to round up with here, and we still have 9 minutes to go, so you can elaborate. And the two questions that we got in advance was why can't Finland and Sweden just join NATO as soon as possible? Interesting question. Let's see if you can answer that. And what can we do as private companies, like the people in the audience here, to assist our nation's defense efforts? So please, Stefan.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I would start with the second one. Good cooperation between companies and the defense forces is crucial in peacetime, and of course, especially in times of crisis. It's about security of supply, what we in Swedish call försörjningsberedskap, and the private companies plays a very important role in that chain of different kind of measures and goods and supplies and so forth. So why don't you make sure that your company is on the map, on the defense forces map, so to say, on the radar, that they know what you are doing, and they know also that they know that what role you could play in the chain for security of supply in peacetime, but also in times of crisis. So have a chat with the defense forces close to you. What could you do? What could your role be if you want to play a role? Then the other question, or the first question, why can't Finland and Sweden join NATO? Well, the short answer should be, why not? But I won't even pretend that I'm neutral in this issue, that I don't have a personal opinion, because I have, ever since high school, I guess, I've been a great fan of Finnish NATO membership and Swedish NATO membership. I think we should have joined NATO in the 90s, when all the Eastern Bloc and the Baltic countries were joined or were about to join. We could have surfed on the same wave. Kremlin wouldn't have noticed that, because all the corridors smelled of vodka and expensive cologne water. Then we wouldn't be here discussing this topic anymore. But that didn't happen. That was a pity. It was strange, but it's never too late. Finland and Sweden are both partners with NATO. We have the so-called enhanced opportunities. We have common exercises. We have same standards concerning material. We have been practicing together. We have been operating in international peacekeeping operations side by side. The step to full membership is, in practical terms, very short. But as we know, politics is not that easy. Politicians should they need an opportunity and a motive. The motive shouldn't be difficult to to find in these times. But the opportunity, that's a tricky one. Of course, we need a political will in both countries. We also need a public opinion because NATO, in fact, demands that the public opinion could be measured in some way in favor of NATO membership in the countries who apply. I definitely don't think we should have a referendum. Not in these times. It would be a party for the trolls, the trolling. So never arrange a referendum in this issue. Finland and Sweden should act together, hand in hand, just like we did in the 90s when we joined the European Union. We have elections coming up in Finland in March next year. You have elections in Sweden coming up in September this year. If there is a change in the composition of the government in Sweden and in Finland, the situation might be new. And I definitely think that the debate before the elections in Sweden, even if we know that the debate is always about school and healthcare, important issues, of course, now or never there would be an opportunity, a momentum for also discussing security issues and Sweden's and Finland's role towards as far as NATO is concerned. If there is one single politician who says that the topic is not actual, it's not an issue this time either, I would recommend that they change to another business and politics, because it's definitely on the agenda, both in Finland and in Sweden.
Great. I sort of interpreted that as a recommendation. I will also give the opportunity for Johan, Hans-Tino, and Joe to, during 60 seconds, give a recommendation to the audience. Anything you want to stress that is important now, short term. So please, I mean, Johan, you can start if you like.
Well, I will mention something about the unknown knowns or unknown unknowns. Just to play a short scenario then for Russia stopping or decreasing gas flow further on into Europe, that will surge the prices. That will lead to, as Hans showed in his presentation, that you can buy LNG from Qatar, etc. But there will be nations that will be priced out from the market then, as Pakistan, for example, who has its president flying into Moscow today in order to speak to Putin. So there will be cascade effects if this escalates, and that is hard to spot at this stage.
To keep an eye on that. And Hans-Tino, do you have any recommendation? 60 seconds.
Yeah, I would say that just from a shipping perspective, a large part of our maritime clients are tanker operators, including LNG, and many of the LNG fleets that were available, they were actually redirected to European trade, meaning that they were not available for all the other trade, just to come back to what Johan just mentioned. So it has effects on everybody else. I think that the most important thing is that that all the companies that are attending today, they revisit their contingency plans and do not think that they can just cover the repercussions here, because most of these contingency plans have not been made for such a situation. And that is important to have a rethink, maybe just half a day, as you said, an exercise, identified some kind of gaps, and then address some of these things. It might actually be energy prices. It might not just be some physical impact, but energy prices, if you're an industrial corporation with using a lot of energy, it will have a huge effect in a short time. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe, your 60 seconds, the last 60 seconds of this webinar. What are your recommendations?
The most important 60 seconds. I'm going to double tap on Stefan. Private companies need to be very clear on what their company identity is and what their value proposition is. And that has to be understood both within government and by partners. And I go to the second point of that. It is understanding partnerships and what you gain from a government to business or a business to business relationship. There is multiple advantages to that, and I just say that no one has a corner on any part of the market when you talk to the intel world, the sustainment world, the fires world, the maneuver world, this whatever world. And that leads into my last point. It is the value of alliances, and the same comment is made about what nations contribute. And, you know, being part of a 26 nation coalition in Iraq, as a chief of staff, being a commander of a 48 nation alliance in Afghanistan, to include Swedish officers, it's understanding what each nation brings to the fight, that everyone contributes. Size does matter, but capability matters more. And then there is strength in numbers. And by the collective energy of everybody and contributions, you are much better off than a piecemeal independent effort. And that would be my 60 seconds.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent ending of this webinar. And by that, I would like to thank you for participating in the audience, and also thank excellent keynote speakers, excellent ideas and insights. And we have a lot of things to do right now. So, and the last recommendation from me is to, if you have any questions, if you have the need for assistance to conduct an exercise during half a day or something like that, just send an email. Just very simple reply on the email that you got the link to this webinar on. So thank you very much. Take care. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.